The Soviet Union's worst weapons, according to the US. Myths versus reality. Picture this. It's the Cold War, a time of spies, secret tech, and two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, locked in a battle for global dominance. Tanks rolled, missiles soared, and both sides were racing to build the ultimate arsenal. But what did the US think of Soviet weapons? Which ones did they call failures? And were they really that bad? Or was it just clever propaganda? Let's dive into the drama, unpack the truth, and throw in some economic insights and my own take on what went down. The Cold War wasn't just about who had the bigger bombs. It was a war of ideas, too. The US and USSR were constantly trying to outshine each other while trashing the other's reputation. In this story, we'll explore three Soviet weapons the US labeled as flops: the T-62 tank, the Scarab missile system, and the Pecheneg machine gun. We'll dig into why the US criticized them, whether that criticism held up, and how propaganda shaped the narrative. Plus, I'll share my thoughts on what these so-called failures really meant in the grand scheme of things. The Cold War was as much about headlines as it was about hardware. The US used every trick in the book: Hollywood movies, news articles, even rigged demos at arms expos, to paint Soviet weapons as clunky and unreliable. Why? Because making the USSR look weak wasn't just about morale. It was about convincing the world and America's allies that US tech was the gold standard. But let's be real, the US wasn't perfect either. Take the F-35 fighter jet program, costing a jaw-dropping $1.7 trillion and still plagued by glitches and maintenance headaches. Or the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which costs $2 billion per plane and is so expensive it's barely used. So, when the US called Soviet weapons failures, was it legit criticism or just shade thrown to win the PR war? To get why some Soviet weapons got a bad rap, let's talk money. The Soviet Union was spending big, up to 15 to 20% of its GDP, on defense during the 1960s to 1980s, according to Western estimates. Compare that to the US, which spent about 5 to 7% of its much larger GDP. The USSR's economy was smaller, about $2 trillion in the 1980s versus America's $4 to $5 trillion. So they had to stretch every ruble to keep up. The Soviets' centrally planned economy meant they could pour resources into massive projects like tanks or space programs, but also led to bureaucratic hiccups and sometimes cut corners on quality. Still, they churned out weapons that rivaled the West's, often at a fraction of the cost. That's worth keeping in mind when we look at what the US called flops. The T-62 rolled out in the early 1960s as the next step up from the iconic T-55. It was a big deal because it had the world's first smoothbore 115mm gun, a game-changer at the time. The Soviets bet big on this tank, hoping it would dominate the battlefield. But the US wasn't impressed, calling it a letdown. So what's the deal? Why the US dissed it? American military analysts pointed to a few issues. Weak armor. Compared to US tanks like the M60 Patton, the T-62's armor was less effective against new anti-tank missiles. Clunky maneuverability. It was heavy and struggled on rough terrain. Outdated tech. Its fire control systems were basic compared to American tanks, making it less accurate in a fight. Sound bad, right? But hold up, let's dig deeper. The T-62 was built for a specific purpose: mass production for a potential all-out war, maybe even a nuclear one. The Soviets prioritized quantity and simplicity over high-tech bells and whistles. That smoothbore gun, it was so innovative that the US later copied the idea for their M1 Abrams tanks. The T-62 saw action in conflicts from Afghanistan to the Middle East. In Iraq, even outdated T-62s gave coalition forces a run for their money. Sure, they weren't as fancy as American tanks, but they were tough, easy to fix, and could be churned out in huge numbers. That's a win in a lot of war scenarios. Building a T-62 cost about $300,000 in 1960s dollars, while an M60 patent set the U.S. back around $700,000. This let the Soviets flood the field with tanks, exporting over 20,000 T-62s to allies like Syria and East Germany. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, it wasn't just a tank. It was a geopolitical tool, helping the USSR flex its influence worldwide. My take: was the T-62 a failure? Nah, I don't buy it. It wasn't a superstar like the T-34 or T-72, but it did its job. It was affordable, reliable, and got the Soviets' point across on the global stage. The U.S. criticism feels more like propaganda than a fair shake. Think of the T-62 like a classic pickup truck. Not the flashiest, but it gets the job done and keeps running no matter what you throw at it. What was the Scarab? Known in the USSR as the OTR-21 Tachka, NATO called it SS-21 Scarab. This tactical missile system hit the scene in the 1970s. It was designed to strike targets up to 70 miles away with pinpoint accuracy. Sounds cool, right? But the U.S. called it a dud, citing issues with precision and reliability. The U.S. critique. Here's what American experts said about the Scarab. Lousy accuracy. The missiles could miss targets by dozens of yards, making them less effective against fortified positions. Complicated systems. Its electronics were outdated even for the 1970s, leading to spotty performance. Reliability issues. Sometimes, the missiles just wouldn't launch due to fuel system glitches. Harsh, but is there truth to it? Let's break it down. The Scarab was built for rapid deployment and overwhelming strikes, not surgical precision. In a Cold War scenario, where the USSR was prepping for a massive clash with NATO, the idea was to rain down fire, not snipe specific targets. It was part of a shock and awe strategy, not a precision tool like today's cruise missiles. Despite the criticism, the Scarab wasn't a total wash. It was exported to over 20 countries, including Syria and Yemen, per SIPRI data. If it was such a failure, why did so many nations buy it? In conflicts like the Yemeni civil war, Scarab missiles were used to devastating effect, even if they weren't laser precise. They got the job done for armies that needed affordable firepower. The economic breakdown. Exact costs for the Scarab are murky. Soviet records are still classified, but it was way cheaper than its U.S. counterpart, the MGM-52 Lance, which cost about $1 million per launcher. The Scarab's lower price made it a go-to for cash-strapped militaries, though its budget electronics may have contributed to its shortcomings. The Scarab feels like a case of ambition outpacing tech. The Soviets wanted a cheap, mass-produced missile system, and they got it, but at the cost of precision. By the 1980s, warfare was shifting toward accuracy over raw power, and the Scarab struggled to keep up. Still, calling it a failure is a stretch. It was a product of its time, and for many countries, it was a game changer. The U.S. just had different priorities and a bigger budget. The Pecheneg machine gun, developed in the 1990s, was the USSR's and later Russia's attempt to build a rugged, reliable weapon for infantry. Based on the trusty PKM, it had a fancy cooling system to keep the barrel from overheating. But the U.S. wasn't impressed, calling it clunky and impractical. What the U.S. said. Here's the American critique. Too heavy. At around 18 pounds, without ammo, the Pecheneg was a beast to carry. Bulky design. Its 4-foot length made it awkward in fast-moving combat. Not enough bang. The U.S. argued it didn't pack enough punch compared to lighter machine guns like the M249 SAW. Fair points? Maybe. But the Pecheneg was built for a different kind of fight, long, drawn-out battles where reliability was king. Its cooling system let it fire for extended periods without jamming, which was a big deal in brutal conditions like the Chechen Wars. The real deal. In real-world combat, the Pecheneg proved its worth. Russian troops in Chechnya loved it for its durability and ability to keep firing under pressure. It wasn't perfect for every scenario, but it wasn't meant to be. It was a workhorse, not a race car. The cost factor. A Pecheneg cost about $2,000,3,000 to produce, compared to $4,000 for an M249. That affordability made it a favorite for armies that couldn't splurge on high-end gear. It was built to last, and it did, still in use today in some conflicts. My thoughts. The Pecheneg got a bad rap because warfare was changing. By the 1990s, militaries wanted lighter, more mobile weapons, and the Pecheneg's heft didn't fit the trend. But that doesn't make it a failure. It was a solid tool for what it was designed to do: provide relentless firepower in tough conditions. The U.S. criticism seems more about differing military philosophies than actual flaws. How the U.S. spun the narrative. The U.S. was a master at spinning stories to make Soviet weapons look bad. Here's how they did it. Hollywood. Movies like Rambo showed Soviet tanks and choppers breaking down or getting outclassed by American grit. Media. Magazines like Time and Newsweek ran stories calling Soviet tech outdated and shoddy. Staged fails. At arms expos, there were rumors of the U.S. sabotaging Soviet gear to make it look unreliable. But the truth? Soviet weapons often held their own, and sometimes outperformed the West's. Let's look at a few examples. AK-47. This rifle became a global icon for its simplicity and reliability. U.S. soldiers in Vietnam ditched their finicky M16s for captured AKs. May Shuguet. This jet was so nimble, it gave American pilots nightmares in Vietnam. Typhoon submarines. The biggest subs ever built, they could hide under Arctic ice and deliver a nuclear punch. When push came to shove, Soviet weapons proved their worth. The Mi-24 Hind helicopter terrorized enemies in Afghanistan. T-72 tanks held their own in Iraq. And Soviet S-75 missile systems shot down U.S. planes left and right in Vietnam. The failure label didn't always stick when the shooting started. USSR versus USA. Money shaped the Cold War as much as missiles did. Here's the breakdown. In the 1980s, the U.S. GDP was $4 to $5 trillion. The USSR's was about $2 trillion. The USSR spent up to 20% of its GDP on defense, compared to the U.S.'s 6%. An M1 Abrams tank cost $4 million. The T-72 was about $1 million. The Soviets leaned on mass production and affordability, while the U.S. went for high-tech, high-cost gear. Both approaches had strengths and weaknesses, but the USSR's ability to churn out weapons on a tighter budget was impressive. Russia, the USSR's successor, still uses upgraded versions of Soviet designs like the T-72, now T-90, and S-300/S-400 air defense systems. These weapons are so durable they're still top-tier decades later. That's a testament to Soviet engineering. What do we learn from all this? First, don't buy into hype or anti-hype. The U.S. called Soviet weapons failures, but many of them were battle-tested and widely used. Second, great engineering can come from anywhere, even under tough economic conditions. The Soviets proved that with their iconic designs. The story of Soviet weapons is one of innovation, rivalry, and a whole lot of spin. The T-62, Scarab, and Pecheneg may not have been perfect, but they weren't the disasters the U.S. made them out to be. They were tools of their time, built for a specific purpose, and they often delivered. The Cold War taught us that truth can cut through propaganda, and a legacy of Soviet weapons lives on. Hey folks, if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. What's your favorite piece of Cold War tech? Got any stories or thoughts about the U.S.-Soviet rivalry? Share them below, and let's keep the conversation going.